Trust is the most fragile thread in the human tapestry. It's not given freely and it's not kept easily. It's woven from 1,000 small, unguarded moments, a shared glance, a secret kept, a hand offered in the dark. We believe we know the shape of the people we love, the solid ground of their character. But what happens when that ground begins to tremble? What happens when a single, simple request, like the one that starts this story, splits the world into before and after? You think you know what love is, what sacrifice means. You think you've seen the face of devotion, but you haven't seen it until you've watched a woman stand in her wedding dress, on the day that was supposed to be perfect, and be asked to leave it all behind. This story is about the courage it takes to take off the old clothes, to step into the unknown, not because you want to, but because you trust the one asking you to. It is a testament to the kind of trust that doesn't just survive the storm, but learns how to build a new world from the wreckage. I was just a ranch hand, someone who knew more about the stubbornness of a mule and the patience of a good horse than I ever did about the tangled, heart-wrenching business of people. My name is Elias, and my life was defined by the creak of leather and the wide, indifferent sky of the Arizona Territory. I dealt in the concrete, fences that needed mending, cattle that needed moving, and the simple, exhausting routine that kept a man's mind from wandering into dangerous territory. That was before I met Lily, before I saw a woman's heart break in the dusty aisle of a country church, and then watched her rebuild it, piece by painstaking piece, in the back of a rattling wagon. I'd known Bill since we were both boys, running wild through the scrubland with nothing but a pocket knife and a spirit for adventure. He was a good man, built of the same sinew and grit as the land we worked. But he was a man of few words, which is why it was such a shock when he told me he was getting hitched. Found me a good woman, Eli. Her name's Lily. She's got a laugh like a bell and a spirit that could hold up the sky. I'd never seen him so struck. It was a giddy, almost scared look in his eyes, like he'd found a treasure he wasn't sure he was worthy of. The wedding was a small affair in the town's old mission church, the one with the cracked bell and the faded frescoes of saints that looked more tired than holy. It was meant to be a simple ceremony, a nod to a new beginning for two people who'd seen their fair share of sorrow. Bill had lost his family to a fever years back, and Lily had come to town as a war widow, her past a closed book nobody dared to open. They seemed to be finding solace in each other, two ghosts learning to be flesh and blood again. The church was filled with a scattering of folks, neighbors, Bill's fellow ranchers, and a few of Lily's friends from the town's haberdashery where she worked. The air was thick with the scent of wildflowers that had been hastily arranged in mason jars and the nervous energy of the couple. I stood by Bill's side, my best suit feeling like a straitjacket, my hands clammy in my pockets. I wasn't one for ceremony. Give me a sunrise over the mesa any day. But this was important to him. That made it important to me. When the door at the back of the church creaked open, a collective sigh seemed to ripple through the room. There she was, Lily. And for a moment the drab, worn-out space was a cathedral. She was a vision in white, but it was a heavy, faded, borrowed white. The dress wasn't new. It was likely a hand-me-down that had seen its share of other brides, its lace a little frayed, its hem a little dusty. But on her it didn't matter. Her dark hair was piled high, a few stray curls framing a face that was flushed with emotion. Her eyes, the color of summer storms, were fixed on Bill, shining with a love so pure it made my chest ache. She walked down the aisle, her steps slow and deliberate, holding a small bouquet of wild roses. Everything was perfect. The way the afternoon sun spilled through the stained glass window, casting a patchwork of colors on the worn wooden floor. The way Bill's breath hitched in his throat as he watched her approach. The way I felt a lump form in my own throat, a witness to a miracle of the heart. She reached us, her hand finding Bill's. The priest, a man who smelled of whiskey and old books, cleared his throat. The vows were spoken, the ancient words of commitment echoing in the quiet space. Lily's voice was a soft melody, Bill was a raspy murmur. The moment felt suspended, frozen in amber. He took her hand to place the ring on her finger, his grandmother's simple gold band. And then he did something that shattered the peace. He stopped. He didn't complete the ritual. He just stood there holding her hand, staring at the ring. Then he looked up into her eyes and a great, shuddering sigh escaped his lips. A tear, glistening, treacherous, carved a path down his weathered cheek. It was a sight I'd never seen on him, a vulnerability so raw it felt like a violation of his privacy. "Lily," he said, his voice so low it was almost a whisper. Everyone in the church strained to hear. I saw a flicker of confusion in her eyes, the first crack in her radiant smile. "Lily, we can't do this. Not like this." A collective murmur ran through the small congregation. The priest, startled, looked down at his book, then back up at Bill, his mouth open in silent protest. What do you mean?" Lily asked, her smile faltering completely, replaced by a mask of bewildered hurt. Did you change your mind?" Her voice was thin, a thread about to snap. "No, not that. Never that," he said, shaking his head vigorously. He cupped her face in his rough, calloused hands, a gesture so tender it was almost agonizing to watch. "I love you more than I've ever loved anything." But he looked her up and down, from the borrowed dress to the borrowed veil, a deep sadness settling in his eyes. "Take off those old clothes." The words hung in the air, a noose of misunderstanding. Gasps of disbelief echoed in the stuffy room. I saw the glimmer of unshed tears in Lily's eyes. I saw the judgment on the faces of the women in the congregation, the pity, the venom. He was rejecting her, on their wedding day. The man she was about to marry was telling her to take off her dress. I felt a white-hot flash of anger. What the hell was he doing? Had he lost his mind? I took a half-step forward, ready to intervene, ready to knock some sense into him. But then I saw the look in his eyes. It wasn't disgust or rejection. It was a deep, profound, and desperate love. It was the look of a man who was about to sacrifice his own happiness for something he believed in more. Lily's jaw trembled. Her face, a moment ago a portrait of joy, now registered a storm of emotions: shame, hurt, confusion, and a deep, searing anger. She started to pull her hand away from his, but he held on tight. These are the only clothes I have," she finally whispered, her voice breaking. The words were a confession of her poverty, a reality she tried to hide under the borrowed finery. "This dress, it's not mine. It's Mrs. Henderson's. It's the only one that fit." Her gaze dropped to the worn floorboards, a tear finally escaping to fall on the dusty lace. Bill's own eyes were wet now. He shook his head, a stubborn set to his jaw. "No, Lily, these are not the only clothes you have." He let go of her face, his hands trailing down her arms, his touch hesitant. "I'm not asking you to take them off for me, not like that." He gestured around the church at the curious, judgmental faces of their neighbors. "These are the clothes of your past, the clothes of a woman who was left, who lost her way, who had to borrow a life. They are the old, tired rags of everything you've been through. The widow, the outsider, the one who had to survive." I could see the congregation starting to shift uncomfortably, trying to decipher his words. Lily's face had gone pale, the color draining from her cheeks. The simple-minded could only see a humiliating public rejection, but I was starting to see something else. A man willing to burn his entire future to the ground to give his bride a new one. "Lily," he continued, his voice growing stronger, more resolute. He was preaching a sermon that no one in that room could hear but her. "Do you trust me?" he asked, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that was almost palpable. It was a simple question, but it carried the weight of a lifetime. She looked at him for a long, drawn-out moment, the silence in the church so thick you could have cut it with a knife. The woman named Lily, the war widow, the stranger in a borrowed dress, looked at the man who was asking her to shed her only finery, to stand naked, metaphorically speaking, in front of all these people. It was the moment of truth. Slowly, so slowly it was like watching a flower bloom in fast forward, she nodded. A single, trembling nod. "I trust you," she said, the whisper carrying more weight than any shout. And then she did it. With shaking hands, she reached up and unpinned the veil from her hair. She crumpled the delicate fabric in her fist and let it fall to the floor. Then She turned her back to the audience and began to work at the long line of buttons running down the back of the dress. It was an act of immense vulnerability, a public unmaking. I saw the muscles in her back strain as she shrugged the bodice from her shoulders. Her white, utilitarian undergarments were suddenly exposed, a stark contrast to the ornate dress. She stepped out of the heavy fabric, leaving it in a heap on the floor. She stood there in the simple, unadorned cotton of her slip, shivering in the cool air of the church. It was the bravest thing I'd ever seen. Bill didn't hesitate. He quickly shed his own coat and with a gentleness that belied his rough hands, placed it around her shoulders. It was huge on her, swamping her, but she clutched it to her chest like a shield. He knelt down, picked up the discarded dress and took something from his pocket, his grandmother's ring. He didn't put it on her finger. He held it out to her, resting in the palm of his hand. "This is my grandmother's ring," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It was given to her by my grandfather when they had nothing but a patch of land and a dream. He didn't give it to her in a church, Lily. He gave it to her under the open sky, with the stars as their witnesses, because he wanted her to know that his love was the one thing in this world that was free from the rules of men." He looked at her, a world of hope in his eyes. "We're not going to get married in a church, Lily. We're going to get married out there on my land, where the only judge is the sun and the only witness is the wind. We are going to write our own vows, speak our own truth. That dress, it was never you. It was a costume, and I don't want to marry a costume. I want to marry the woman who fights, who endures, who trusted me enough to take off her old clothes in front of God and everyone." A stunned, profound silence fell over the church. It wasn't the silence of judgment anymore. It was the silence of reverence. Lily looked at Bill, and the storm in her eyes began to clear. The shame and hurt were replaced by a dawning realization, a profound sense of being seen. She wasn't being rejected. She was being liberated. She was being asked to step out of the borrowed past and into a shared future, however uncertain, however frightening. A sob escaped her, followed by a laugh that was choked with tears. She nodded, her hand reaching out to close around the ring. "Yes," she said, her voice no longer a whisper but a clear, strong declaration. "Yes, Bill, anywhere. I'll go anywhere with you." He helped her back into his coat, buttoning it up to her neck. He picked up her discarded wedding dress, the veil, the bouquet, and bundled them all into a heap in the corner. He took her hand, and together they turned to face the congregation. A collective breath was held. "I'm sorry, folks," Bill said, his voice a little shaky but ringing with newfound determination. "This isn't the wedding you came for, but I promise you this is the wedding that matters." Without another word, he led Lily down the aisle, past the open-mouthed priest, past the shocked faces of their family and friends. I was the first to move, my own feet carrying me out of the pew and following them through the heavy wooden doors. I saw a dozen other people follow suit, faces full of wonder and confusion. When we all got outside, the sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and purple. It was an omen, a sign as clear as any from heaven. Bill helped Lily into the back of his wagon, the one he used to haul hay and feed. It was a far cry from a carriage, a far cry from a church, and it was perfect. He helped her sit on a bale of hay, and for a moment the two of them just sat there, alone in the middle of the dusty street, looking out at the vast, open land that was to be their home. I walked back to my own horse, my heart pounding. I had just witnessed a miracle born of trust and love, not in a house of God, but in the heart of a man who was willing to risk everything. The story of Lily and Bill had just begun, but the first chapter, the one that would define their entire lives, had been written in that church. I couldn't help but feel a pang of envy. What must it be like to have someone who sees you so completely, who loves you so fiercely that they'd destroy your illusions just to build you a reality? I had never known love like that. I wasn't sure I was capable of it. But watching them, seeing the raw hope in Lily's eyes as she clutched Bill's coat around her, I wanted to be. The story wasn't over. It was just beginning. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that the hard part was yet to come. You don't burn down your old life without facing the fire. The wagon rumbled out of town, a slow, purposeful beast that seemed to carry the weight of a whole new world on its wooden axles. I followed at a distance on my horse, a silent observer to an unfolding drama I didn't fully understand. The small crowd from the church had dispersed, their initial shock giving way to a buzz of speculation and gossip. The nuptials of Bill and Lily were now the talk of the town, a bizarre and scandalous tale that would be told and retold for years to come. But I wasn't interested in the gossip. I was captivated by the story itself, by the sheer, raw courage of two people who had just walked away from everything familiar to build a life on nothing but trust. The world they were leaving behind was one of rules and expectations, of borrowed finery and whispered secrets. The world they were driving into was a vast, open canvas of possibility. I envied them. I feared for them. The journey to Bill's land took the better part of the day. It was a journey I'd made countless times, but this time every rock, every twist in the trail, every bend in the dry riverbed felt portentous. The sun climbed higher, beating down on us with an unforgiving intensity. I could see Lily in the back of the wagon, sitting with her knees drawn up, her back against a stack of saddles. She was still wearing Bill's coat, a heavy, worn thing that had to be sweltering in the heat, but she didn't take it off. It was a physical manifestation of his promise, a tangible shield against the world that had just rejected her. We finally crested the final hill, and Bill's property came into view. It was a modest spread, a few acres of dry, stubborn land bordered by a meandering creek that was mostly a trickle of mud. There was a simple, one-room cabin that looked like it had been built by a man who valued function over form. There were a few cattle huddled in the shade of a lone cottonwood tree. There was a corral that looked like it needed mending, and a barn that was held together more by hope than by nails. It wasn't much, but it was his. It was a place where the only law was the law of survival. Bill pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the cabin. He jumped down and walked around to the back, his face a mixture of anxiety and hope as he looked up at Lily. She looked down at him, and in that moment, the exhaustion of the day, the trauma of the ceremony, and the uncertainty of the future all seemed to wash over her. A single tear traced a clean path down her dusty cheek. "Welcome home," Bill said, his voice a gruff whisper. It was the most beautiful, terrifying, and honest thing a man could say to a woman. He held out his hand to her and she took it, her grip surprisingly strong. He helped her down and she stood in the dusty yard looking at her new home. The silence stretched, a fragile, waiting thing. I saw her take in the sorry state of the fence, the peeling paint on the cabin, the bleakness of the landscape. It was a far cry from the cozy rooms of the boarding house where she'd been staying. "It's a good place," she said finally, her voice soft but steady. It wasn't a platitude, it was a choice. She was choosing to see the potential. I dismounted, feeling like an intruder. "Bill, I can head back, give you two some privacy," I started to say, but he cut me off. "No, Eli, stay. I need you to witness." He looked at me, his eyes pleading with a vulnerability that made my chest tighten. He was a man who had just burned his own house down, and he needed someone to stand there with him and watch the ashes. He needed someone to tell him that it was okay to rebuild. I nodded, not trusting my own voice. I tied my horse to the corral and stood a respectful distance away as Bill turned to Lily again. "The dress," he said, his voice a little thicker. "Where did you get it?" Lily's face flinched, a flicker of the old shame returning. "I told you, it belonged to Mrs. Henderson. She let me borrow it." "Did she give it to you to keep?" Bill pressed. "No, I was to return it tomorrow. The lace is very old, very precious to her." Bill nodded, a determined look settling on his face. Then he did something that shocked me. He walked over to the pile of belongings in the back of the wagon, a small bundle of Lily's things and the crumpled, discarded wedding dress. He picked up the dress and held it out to her. "Here," he said, "give it to her." Lily stared at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. "What, but it's ruined. The hem is all torn from the dust. I can't give it back like this." "That's the point," Bill said, his voice strangely calm. You're not going to give it back to her to use again. She'll just have to swallow the cost. It's a small price to pay for the truth." He looked at her, a glint of defiance in his eyes. "There's a woman in the next county, I heard. She's a dressmaker, a truly gifted one. We're going to ride there tomorrow, you and I, and you're going to buy yourself a new dress. Not a fancy, borrowed one. Yours, for our wedding." Lily's face crumpled. It wasn't a sad cry, it was a cry of overwhelming relief and gratitude. "But Bill, we don't have the money for that. A dressmaker's work, it would cost a fortune. We have cattle to feed, the fences need mending." He put his hands on her shoulders, looking her in the eye. "We will figure it out. I'll sell the horse I was saving to breed, or we can do the mending ourselves. The fence will hold a little longer. But this, Lily, this is important. I'm not going to start this life with you by building it on borrowed dreams. You deserve something that is yours, a dress that tells your story, not someone else's." The gesture was more than just about a piece of clothing. It was about offering her a piece of identity, a gift of selfhood that had been denied to her since her husband died. She didn't argue, she just nodded, her eyes shining. She took the dirty, crumpled dress from him, and for a moment she looked at it, the fabric that had been meant to be her costume of joy, the symbol of her humiliation. Then, with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of a year's sorrow, she handed it to me. "Eli, would you take this to Mrs. Henderson for me? I can't face her, not yet." I took the dress, holding it as if it were made of glass. It was a strange burden, a symbol of the lies they were leaving behind. "Of course, Lily. I'll tell her it was damaged in the wind." "No," Bill said, his voice firm. "Tell her the truth. Tell her what happened. Let her know that the bride walked out in her underthings for a man who promised her a better life. The truth is the only thing that will set her free." I nodded, a strange sense of purpose settling over me. I was no longer just a bystander. I was a courier for the truth. Bill then turned to Lily and with a flourish that was more endearing than grand took a small, worn box from his pocket. He opened it to reveal a thin, silver bracelet, simple and unadorned. "It was my mother's," he said softly. "It's not much, but it's all I have left of her. I want you to wear it. I want you to know that you are part of my family now, not as a borrowed person, but as my own." Lily's breath caught in her throat. She reached for the bracelet, her fingers trembling. "Bill, it's beautiful." He fastened it around her slender wrist. It was a promise, a simple silver link connecting her to his past and to his future. Later, as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of fire, I sat on the porch of the cabin, taking in the quiet scene. Bill was showing Lily the spring, a tiny, precious source of water that was the heart of his property. I saw her kneel down to cup her hands in the cool water, her laughter ringing out like a bell in the quiet air. It was the first real sound of joy I'd heard from her all day. Bill was watching her, his face open with a love so fierce and protective it was hard to look at. He walked back to the cabin, his arm slung around Lily's shoulder. He was grinning, a genuine, boyish grin that I hadn't seen on his face in years. "Eli, tonight we celebrate. We may not have a wedding cake, but I have a bottle of whiskey that could strip the paint off a barn, and I'm going to share it with my best man." The evening was simple and raw. We sat around a small fire outside the cabin, the smell of wood smoke mingling with the scent of the desert. The whiskey was rough and burned going down, but it warmed the spirit. Lily, now wearing a simple cotton dress she'd packed, sat close to Bill, her hand resting on his knee. The conversation was easy, filled with the gentle, hopeful banter of a couple just starting out. Bill asked her about her childhood, her life before the war, the things she missed. She spoke of her family's small farm, of the music her father used to play, and of the garden her mother had tended. Every word was a deliberate act of sharing, of trusting. She was giving him pieces of her past, knowing he would hold them safe. Later, as the fire died down and the stars began to emerge, painting a breathtaking canopy over the desert, Bill stood up. "Lily, we haven't said our vows. We didn't in that church. I'm not a preacher and I'm not a poet, but I want to do this right." He looked up at the stars, then back at her. "I, Bill, take you, Lily, to be my wife. I promise to share my fire with you on cold nights and my water with you on hot days." I promise to protect you from the storms of the world and to stand beside you in the sunshine. I promise to give you a new dress, a new life, and to never ask you to be anyone other than who you are." Lily looked at him, her face a portrait of love. She stood up, taking his hands in hers. "I, Lily, take you, Bill, to be my husband. I promise to mend your clothes and mend your heart. I promise to be your partner in the fields and your solace in the quiet hours. I promise to learn the language of this land and of your soul. I promise to trust you, even when I don't understand." They kissed, a chaste, heartfelt seal on the pact made under the stars. I felt a deep, aching warmth in my chest, a feeling I hadn't felt in years. I was witnessing something precious, something sacred. The stranger, the war widow, the woman in the borrowed dress had found a home. The man with the simple life and the stubborn love had found his purpose. I left them that night, the image of their silhouettes against the dying embers of the fire etched in my memory. I rode back to town with a heavy heart and a strange lightness in my soul. I delivered the ruined wedding dress to Mrs. Henderson, who was, predictably, furious. But I told her the truth, just as Bill had asked. I told her about the old, borrowed clothes and the promise of a new dress. I told her about the stars and the vows. She was silent for a long time after I finished. Then a strange thing happened. She smiled, a small, grudging but genuine smile. "Well," she said, her voice a low grumble, "I guess I can't be angry at a woman who traded a fancy dress for the good Lord's own cathedral." The gossip in town would change. The story would become less about a scandal and more about a miracle. But the story wasn't over. I knew, with the same instinct that tells a rancher a storm is coming, that the peace they had found was fragile. They had escaped the prison of their old lives, but the world outside was still a place of hardship and scarcity. The real test of their love was only beginning. The weeks that followed were a testament to their resilience. I watched them from a distance, stopping by the ranch whenever I could find an excuse. The ranch began to transform under their joint effort. The fence that was only held together by hope was being mended, post by post, by Bill's sweat and Lily's encouragement. The cabin, once a dark and empty shell, was slowly being filled with small touches of home. A wildflower on the windowsill, a clean, worn rug on the floor, a pot of beans simmering on the stove, filling the air with the rich smell of comfort. The dress, the one made by the seamstress in the next county, was a masterpiece. It was a deep, earthy green, the color of new leaves, a shade that seemed to make Lily's eyes glow. It was simple, elegant, and it fit her like it had been made for her, because it had been. Bill had sold his breeding horse to pay for it. It was the most expensive thing she owned, and she wore it on special occasions, which, according to Bill, was every day she was alive. Their wedding was a small, private affair, a redo of the original ceremony that had gone so terribly wrong. It was held under the cottonwood tree, with just me and a traveling preacher who happened to be passing through. Lily wore her new dress, and Bill wore his best, albeit patched, trousers. It was a simple, quiet, and profoundly beautiful ceremony. There were no awkward silences, no borrowed finery, no judgmental stares. Just the vows they'd already spoken under the stars, now blessed by a man of God. Life fell into a rhythm. The days were long and hard, filled with the work that kept the land alive. But the nights were a different matter. They were filled with quiet conversations, shared laughter, and the gentle intimacy of two people learning each other's souls. I'd often find myself staying for supper, drawn by the warmth and the simple, good food. I'd watch them, a man and a woman who had started with nothing but trust, building a little kingdom. But the old world was a stubborn, patient thing. It didn't like to be discarded. It had a way of reaching out and dragging you back, even when you tried your hardest to escape. For Lily, the old world came calling in the form of a letter. A small, crumpled envelope, delivered by a dusty courier who'd ridden a long way to find her. I was there when she received it. She was patching a pair of Bill's trousers by the window, the afternoon sun casting a warm halo around her. The courier called out and she went to the door, her expression curious. She took the letter, thanked the man, and shut the door. As she sat back down, she looked at the handwriting on the envelope. The color drained from her face. Her hands began to tremble. "What is it, Lily?" Bill asked, putting down his whittling knife. "Who's it from?" She didn't answer for a long moment. She just stared at the letter. Finally, in a voice that was barely a whisper, she said, "It's from my husband's family, his brother Thomas." The name seemed to hang in the air. It was the ghost of her old life, the specter that had been haunting her. The husband she'd lost to the war, the family she'd left behind, the identity she'd been trying to shed. Bill's face was a mask of concern and careful neutrality. "Open it," he said gently. "It's okay." Her fingers, clumsy and shaking, tore open the envelope. She pulled out a single sheet of paper and began to read. Her face, which had been flushed with color, grew pale. Tears welled in her eyes and her lips parted in a soft, pained gasp. I could see Bill's fists clench at his sides, a muscle in his jaw twitching as he fought the urge to snatch the paper from her. "Lily, tell me, what does it say?" She looked up, her eyes lost and terrified. "He knows," she whispered. "He knows about the wedding, about the dress, about everything. He says." Her voice broke and she had to take a breath. "He says I have disgraced my husband's memory. He says I am a faithless woman. He says I must return to his family, to the old home, to atone." She looked down at the letter again, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "He says I have a duty. That my place is with them, to finish my penance for the sin of my husband's death." The accusation was cruel and manipulative, designed to use her grief and her guilt to control her. Bill took the letter from her, his jaw tightening as he read it. He crumpled it in his massive hand. "He's a fool," Bill said, his voice low and furious. "He's a coward trying to drag you back to a life that killed you." "It's more than that," Lily sobbed. "It's about the past. Everything I tried to leave behind. He's right. I did leave them. I left them to mourn alone." "You were a widow, Lily, a young woman who had lost everything. You had a right to a new life," Bill said, his voice full of a righteous anger I hadn't heard before. "Don't you dare let him make you feel guilty for surviving." The argument that followed was one of the most painful things I'd ever witnessed. It wasn't an argument between them, but a war within Lily's own heart. She was torn between the life she had built, the life she loved, and the guilt that had been instilled in her by her old family. She felt the pull of duty, the weight of the accusations. "I need to go back," she finally said, her voice hollow. "Just for a little while, to explain, to make them understand." Bill looked at her, his face a portrait of desperation. "Lily, no, that's what they want. They don't want you to explain. They want to trap you. They will never let you go." "You don't know that," she argued, her voice rising. "They are his family. They were my family. I cannot just abandon them. They are hurt and angry, and they deserve an explanation." "You owe them nothing. You owe them your life. You already gave them your husband. They don't get to take your soul, too." The words hung in the air, brutal and true. But Lily was not convinced. The old clothes she had tried so hard to shed were being pulled back onto her shoulders, not by a man, but by a sense of duty so ingrained it was almost a reflex. She was a woman of immense strength and endurance, but she was also a woman shaped by a world that demanded sacrifice and service from its women. "I'm not asking for your permission, Bill," she said, her voice hardening. "I'm telling you what I need to do." The fight left Bill's eyes. He was defeated. He couldn't fight a ghost. He could only watch as the woman he loved prepared to walk back into a den of wolves. "Fine," he said, his voice a strained whisper. "Then I'll go with you. I won't let you face them alone." "No," Lily said, her voice sharp. "If you come, they will see it as a threat. They will see it as me bringing my new husband to rub it in their faces. I have to face them alone. It's the only way." I watched the exchange, my heart in my throat. I could see the logic in both sides, and I understood the agony of Lily's decision. It was a choice between duty and love, between the past and the future. The peace they had built was about to be shattered. The next morning, Lily packed a small bag. She was wearing a simple gray dress, a somber color that seemed to absorb her light. Bill watched her in stoic silence, his eyes betraying the turmoil within him. He took a small pouch of coins from his pocket and pressed them into her hand. "For your fare and for whatever you may need," he said, his voice strained. "Promise me you'll come back." "Of course I will," she said, her eyes glistening. "This is my home now." She kissed him, a kiss that was both a promise and a farewell, and then she climbed into the wagon that would take her back to the nearest town. Bill and I stood there, watching the wagon disappear into the distance. The silence between us was a living thing, heavy with fear and dread. "She'll be fine, Bill," I said, the words sounding hollow and meaningless. "She's strong." He didn't answer. He just stood there, his gaze fixed on the horizon. His hands, those rough, calloused hands that had mended fences and held her tight, were shaking. I could see the battle raging in his heart. He had given her the freedom to make her own choice, to leave the old clothes behind for good. But the act of letting go, of trusting her to find her way back, was the most terrifying thing he had ever done. The days that followed were a study in quiet desperation. Bill threw himself into his work, mending things that didn't need mending, working himself to exhaustion. I stayed with him as much as I could, trying to fill the silence with talk of cattle and weather, anything to distract him from the dark thoughts I knew were plaguing him. Every sunset we would find ourselves on the porch, looking down the dusty road, waiting for a sign of her return. The days stretched into a week, then two. The silence in the cabin was deafening. Bill had become a ghost, haunted by the possibility that he had lost her. He began to doubt his own actions. Maybe he had been too hard on her. Maybe he should have gone with her. Maybe the whole thing, the church, the dress, the vows, was all a fool's dream. And then, just as hope was beginning to fade, a wagon appeared on the horizon. It was a different wagon, one we didn't recognize. My heart seized in my chest. Bill stood up, his face a mask of fear and longing. The wagon drew closer. I could see that it wasn't a courier but a family, a man and his wife. As it pulled up to the cabin, I recognized the man. It was Thomas, Lily's brother-in-law. He was a stern-looking man with the hard lines of a farmer etched into his face. His wife, a woman with pinched lips and cold eyes, sat beside him. Bill stepped forward, his body tense. "Where is Lily?" he demanded, his voice sharp as a knife. Thomas looked down at him from the wagon, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "She's safe," he said. "She's where she belongs, with her family." The words hit Bill like a physical blow. He staggered back a step. You tricked her," he said, his voice cracking with anger. "You told her to come back and you've kept her hostage." "We did no such thing," Thomas said, his voice dripping with false piety. "She came of her own free will. She understood her duty. She realized the mistake she made, running off with a man like you. She's staying with us to make amends. She's not coming back." It was the most devastating lie I had ever heard. I knew Bill had seen it coming. The old world had won. The old, borrowed clothes had been put back on. Lily's story, it seemed, was over. She had been recaptured by the past. Bill's shoulders slumped. The light in his eyes went out. He looked like a man who had just been told his entire world had ceased to exist. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He just stood there, his face utterly blank, his spirit shattered. Thomas, having delivered his blow, clicked his tongue at the horses and the wagon moved on, leaving Bill in a cloud of dust. I put my hand on his shoulder. "Bill," I started to say, but the words died in my throat. What could I possibly say? He didn't respond. He just turned and walked back into the cabin, the door closing with a soft click that sounded like a death knell. The silence that followed was the loneliest sound I'd ever heard. The peace, the hope, the new life he had painstakingly built with Lily had been ripped away. He was left alone in his cabin with nothing but the ghost of a promise. The days that followed were filled with a bleak gray silence. The ranch, which had been filled with hope and purpose, felt like a tomb. Bill didn't eat, didn't sleep. He just moved through the motions of life, a shell of the man he'd been. I tried to be there for him, bringing food, talking, just sitting with him. But he was unreachable, lost in a world of grief and guilt. He blamed himself for letting her go, for trusting the wrong people. I started to lose hope myself. The story of Lily and Bill, which had begun as a testament to love and trust, seemed destined for a tragic, bitter end. I couldn't stand the thought of it. I couldn't stand seeing my friend, a man who had shown such profound faith, reduced to this. One evening, about a week after the visit from Thomas, I was sitting on the porch of the cabin, listening to the wind whistle through the cracks in the walls. Bill was inside, a silent, unmoving presence. I was about to leave, feeling defeated, when I heard a sound, a rustle from the direction of the creek. I stiffened, my hand moving to the worn handle of my knife. A figure emerged from the twilight, a woman, small and wrapped in a dark shawl. My heart hammered in my chest. It couldn't be, could it? "Lily," I whispered, the name tasting of disbelief. She ran to me, clutching my arm. She looked terrible, exhausted, pale, with dark circles under her eyes, but she was real, she was here. "Eli," she gasped, her voice a ragged whisper. Is he here? Is he okay?" "Lily, what, how?" I stammered, my mind reeling. She shook her head. "There's no time, I have to see him." I didn't ask any more questions. I opened the cabin door and led her inside. Bill was sitting at the table, staring at a cold cup of coffee. He didn't even look up. But when Lily walked in, a soft, broken sound escaped his lips. He lifted his head, and the sight of her standing there in the dim light of the cabin seemed to shatter his grief. It was a look of pure, raw joy. "Lily," he breathed, his voice cracking. He stood up so fast his chair clattered to the floor. He rushed to her, pulling her into his arms, burying his face in her hair. "Lily, oh God, Lily." She clung to him, sobbing into his chest. The two of them held each other, an island of emotion in a sea of quiet. I stepped back, giving them the space they needed, my own heart aching with relief. "How?" Bill asked, his voice muffled. "How did you get away?" She pulled back, her eyes red-rimmed but shining with a new, fierce light. "I told you," she said, her voice trembling but strong. "I am my own woman. I made a promise to you, and I kept it." She took a deep, shuddering breath. "Thomas and his wife, they wanted to keep me as a servant, to punish me for the sin of living. They took my clothes, the dress you gave me. They locked me in a room. They thought they could break my spirit." She paused, her gaze locking with Bill's. "But they didn't know who they were dealing with." I learned the language of survival. I realized I could fight. I realized that the courage to start over was just a decision I had already made. It was a story of incredible endurance. She had been a prisoner, but she had not been broken. She had remembered the woman she had become, the woman who had walked out of a church in her underthings because she believed in a man's promise. She had not allowed herself to be put back in the old, borrowed clothes of shame. She had clawed her way back to the life she had chosen. "We have to leave," she said, her voice suddenly urgent. "Thomas has filed a complaint with the county. He's saying I've been kidnapped. They will be coming for me. He's saying I'm not right in the mind, that you've stolen me away." She looked at Bill, a new fear in her eyes. "Bill, they could take me away. They could put me in an asylum." The threat was chillingly real. It was a weapon of the old world, designed to crush the freedom of a woman who had dared to choose her own path. Bill's face hardened into a mask of grim determination. The helplessness was gone, replaced by the fierce, protective love that had first driven him to ask her to take off her old clothes. "Then we'll run," he said, his voice quiet but resolute. "We'll find a place where they won't find us. We'll start over again." "Start over?" she asked, a hint of desperate laughter in her voice. "We just started over, Bill. We just started building something. I won't lose this. I won't lose you, not again." The decision was made in an instant. It wasn't a choice driven by logic but by love. It was a decision to trust in each other, to sacrifice the small, hard-won comfort of their home for the safety of their future. They would run. They would become outlaws, drifters, fugitives, but they would be together. We gathered what little we could carry. Bill grabbed his rifle, a few sacks of supplies, and the pouch of coins he'd given Lily, which she had managed to hide from Thomas. Lily, with a soft murmur, reached for the silver bracelet on her wrist, the one Bill had given her. Then she reached into a small bag she'd brought with her and pulled out the new dress. The green one. The one that was hers. She held it to her chest, a tangible symbol of her will. Bill looked at me, his eyes full of a deep, knowing sadness. "Eli, I'm sorry to drag you into this. They'll come for you too for helping us." I shook my head. "I don't care. I would do it 1,000 times over. Watching the two of you, you showed me what it means to be brave. You showed me what it means to love." It was the truth. They had taught me more about courage and resilience than any book or any sermon ever had. They had shown me that the human spirit wasn't about grand gestures, but about the quiet, unshakable decision to trust, to endure, to fight for the life you believed in. The night was dark and the trail ahead was uncertain. They had no wagon, only 2 horses I had hastily saddled. They would travel light and travel fast. As they were about to mount, Lily turned to me. Her face, illuminated by the soft light of the moon, was a portrait of gratitude and bittersweet farewell. "Eli," she said, her voice soft and firm, "take this." She pressed a small, folded piece of paper into my hand. It was the letter from Thomas. "I'm done with it," she said. "I don't need the words anymore. I have a new story to write." Bill helped her onto the horse, then swung up onto his own. He looked down at me, his features a mixture of sorrow and pride. "Take care of my place, Eli," he said, his voice gruff. "I'll come back for it one day, I promise." And then, with a soft command, they rode off into the darkness, disappearing into the vast, untamed landscape that had become their sanctuary. I stood alone on the porch, the letter crumpled in my hand, listening to the sound of the hoofbeats fade into the night. The silence that followed was filled with the echoes of their journey, the trust, the heartbreak, the resilience, and the final, defiant act of freedom. I never saw them again, not in person. I heard rumors, of course. Whispers of a couple who had set up a homestead far to the north, in a territory so remote that the law had no reach. Whispers of a woman who wore a beautiful green dress on her wedding day, and a man who looked at her like she was the only star in the sky. I never forgot them. The story of the bride in the borrowed dress, the man who asked her to take off her old clothes, and the trust that had set her free. I kept the crumpled letter for a long time, a memento of the past they'd shed and the future they'd built. Eventually, I buried it under the cottonwood tree, a final offering to the old world they had so bravely escaped. The story of Lily and Bill was a lesson in the weight of the past and the power of the present. It was a reminder that the truest courage doesn't come from fighting the world, but from having the strength to be your own person, to love fiercely, and to trust in the promise of a new beginning. It was about the journey of a woman who learned to take off her old clothes and finally, truly, wear her own skin. It is a lesson I have carried with me every day. It changed me. It showed me the shape of the unknown, and that sometimes the best way to find it is to let go of what you know.